going to look at relapse, and it's something I wish we didn't have to talk about. I wish I could say that when a recovering addict goes into recovery, everything is fine and they're going to be okay. And of course, it unfortunately doesn't work like that. I'm often asked what the statistics are for relapse. Now, it's my personal opinion. I don't believe there are any reliable, valid statistics, because how do you keep track of all the addicts in the world that have ever gone into recovery? But there are some indications, at least, that the vast majority of addicts unfortunately relapse. And depending on the type of drug, the statistics vary, because certain drugs are just more difficult to recover from, because they're not only psychologically addictive, but they're also physically addictive, where the body relies on the actual drug. And coming off the drug is a very painful, physically and emotionally painful experience. But the average at this stage, it varies between 80 and 90% of addicts who relapse, at least in the first year. Some statistics say even higher than that. Now, if you look at between 80 and 90% of addicts relapse, it can be very discouraging, and we can think, well, what is the point? And very often that is sort of the excuse that some addicts will use. There's no point because there is very little chance of me recovering, so why go to all the trouble? And what I often remind them of then is just, well, the fact that 10 to 20% recover, what do they do? There must be something that they are doing, maybe that the rest are not doing. So we're going to look at relapse, what some of the potential contributing factors are that may put somebody more at risk of relapse compared to somebody else who may be able to stay in recovery and not relapse, to be part of the 10 to 20%. There's something in the recovery lingo that we refer to as HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. They speak for themselves, but I want to take them a bit further. It's not just about being hungry, it also refers to malnutrition. It's very important for a recovering addict to practice healthy nutrition. And one of the reasons being that all addicts are malnourished. I'm going to say that again. All addicts are malnourished, even those who may be able to eat healthy during addiction. And the reason why all addicts are malnourished is because the liver spends so much time dealing with the toxins in the drugs that the person ingests, that it doesn't really, and I'm using very simplistic language now, the liver doesn't really get to doing what it's supposed to do to extract nutrition from food as such. So the fact is that all addicts are malnourished, and that often carries on into early recovery. And therefore it is very important for the addict to eat healthy, balanced meals and take vitamins and all that kind of thing. And the reason being, if a person is malnourished or hungry, they don't feel good. And when an addict doesn't feel good, they are far more at risk of cravings, because as I intimated earlier on, they trigger parts of the brain that will bring back the memories of what the individual did to feel better. Angry emotions, addicts have got very little or no control over the emotions for obvious reasons, because of the impairment in the brain. So they've got to learn how to regulate and moderate their emotions. Lonely, the social life. Again, for obvious reasons, addicts don't necessarily have a very healthy social life because of the rejection and isolation, because of their behavior. So they need to really work at developing healthy circles, healthy friendships. And tired, that also not only refers to getting enough sleep, but also recreation. And those are very important factors, because any lack or problem in these areas can make the individual feel negative, or put in a negative state or unresourceful state, as we say, and that may increase the risk of them picking up again. Recovery compliance. I think this is one of the major points: sticking to the plan, sticking to the program. I read up on some research a while ago that they say that patients who are in treatment or recovery for sugar diabetes, high blood pressure and heart disease, more than 50% of those people relapse. Meaning they stop taking the medication, they stop eating healthy, they stop exercising, whatever their recovery protocol may have been. They don't crave, They don't have memories coming back from past use like the addicts do. So why do they relapse? Because of the fact that they think they feel well enough now, so they don't have to do what they need to do anymore. And there's also just a human element. You know, initially it may be hard work to do whatever I need to do for my recovery, and laziness creeps in, and all the reasons and all the excuses that we come up with not to do it. So that is a major, major contributing factor. Cravings, we've spoken about that, the yearning to use, that is a major cause for relapse, obviously. Euphoric recall is basically the fun memories when we started thinking, of course, yes, addiction is hell in many ways, but there's also, in inverted commas, good times involved. And very often what I've experienced, particularly in treatment centers, addicts will start to talk about the pain of the using and how bad things were, and then a funny memory comes up and they will start to talk about that, and they start to laugh and joke, and they start to talk about some of the good times, and that triggers memories at a subconscious level. Not only the memories of the good time, the good times they experienced, but just memories of the actual addiction, everything that goes with it at a subconscious level, and that could trigger the addict personality, and that could also be a contributing factor to relapsing. Complacency, I don't need this, I'm strong enough, I can do this. And that goes with the recovery compliance. I feel strong enough, therefore I can take it easy now. I don't have to go to so many meetings. I don't have to talk to my counselor or my sponsor so often anymore. I've got this, I can do this. And we refer to them as Captain Recovery in recovery, and that is a major, major issue. And that is just part of the human condition, unfortunately, to get to the place where we give ourselves permission to stop doing what we may have been doing to keep ourselves strong. Arrogance, just an arrogant, full of myself kind of attitude. I can do this on my own, I don't need help. And that very often comes from insecurity. I need to prove to everybody else I don't need help, I'm strong enough, I can do it. Also a major issue for recovering addicts. Reservation, we spoke about yesterday, the little room in the back of my mind where I keep all the reasons that I may need to use one day. And an example about this, I was chatting to a client or a patient in a treatment center a few years ago, and he was doing very well. And the day of his, I nearly said release, the day of his discharge, I said to him, so what do you think are some of the potential, we were talking about reservations, what are some of the potential risks or reasons why I may need to use? And he thought about it, and he said, if my fiance breaks up with me, what's the reservation? He hadn't thought about it up until that point, but then he realized. In other words, the reservation is, this is a reason where I may give myself permission to use again because I will not be able to deal with it. It will be too painful. And again, a lot of that is unconscious. It is not a conscious decision. These are the reasons why I may use. They can be triggered unconsciously, and unfortunately, very often only after the fact, after relapse, is the individual able to identify that there was a reservation that they were unaware of. Denial for addicts. Addicts, one of the hallmarks of addiction is denial. Denial meaning not to face up to, not to own up. And what makes denial so complicated for the addict is they don't know they're in denial. They don't even know that they're lying. The addict rationalizes, justifies, and minimizes whatever it is that they do. In other words, they get to a place where they give themselves permission. So to rationalize is if I can explain to myself or to others why this is okay to do. I may be in early recovery, I'm having a very bad day at work, and I rationalize it's really, really challenging for me, it's very difficult, I'm under a lot of stress. And from there, the person moves on to justifying where they give themselves reason. I need some relief, I need a break, and to minimize, downplay the importance or the seriousness of it. Famous last word for relapsing addicts, just one, only one more. Or I'm not going to use heroin, I'm just going to have a drink, downplaying it. So that is a process that is part of addiction and very often remains part of the individual psychology into recovery. And of course, that is a major contributing factor. Metabolites, an interesting principle, interesting factor. Metabolites are really the toxins within the drug that when the person ingests the drug, the liver works towards removing some of the toxins from the drugs, obviously to protect the body. And very often those toxins or metabolites are stored in the body, and particularly, interestingly enough, in areas where there are fatty deposits in the body around the kidneys, the liver, the heart, and various areas. And this could be months, even years into recovery. But what could happen potentially is I'm in recovery, I'm having a bad day, and what happens when I experience stress, physical and emotional stress? The body looks for energy resources to help me deal with the stress. Apart from the release of adrenaline and cortisol, it also looks for, as I said, any areas of energy resources. And what I find quite interesting, some of those areas could be fatty deposits, where in the process now of the body addressing stress, some of those metabolites may be re-released into the bloodstream. And those chemicals or metabolites very often are the mirror, the function of neurochemicals. And neurochemicals are chemicals that the brain releases that carry messages to various parts of the body. And I mentioned earlier the fact that very often the brain and the body recognizes some of the chemical components in the body and allows it into the body, because some of them act as mirrors of the body's natural chemicals. So they carry various messages, and that could also be why sometimes the addict all of a sudden starts craving and can't explain why, because there are no other reasons. And it could be because of the re-release of metabolites in the system. And then there's something I also found very interesting with withdrawal valenced behaviour. But all it means is if I focus on what I'm trying to move away from. And for the addict to focus on no longer using can be very stressful, because they are going against very often years of conditioning and patterning why they needed to use. So I can't use anymore, I have to stay clean. Those kinds of thinking very often create stress, and stress is not very good for the addict in early recovery, especially while they're still learning to use some of the coping mechanisms. So how do I address that? We'll look a bit more at that at a later stage, but to start to focus on what am I moving towards in my recovery, what is good about being in recovery. So these are some of the factors that have been identified in that they contribute towards putting the individual at risk of relapsing or picking up drugs again. We are going to look at the relapse process. It is important to understand that relapse is not just the addict starting to crave and then pick up. There's a whole process which, for the most part, is unconscious, that the addict goes through during this particular process of relapse. And this takes place within a split second. However, if we can develop some kind of understanding of what this process is all about, I believe it can help the addict with regards to putting some measures in place that can help protect them from this particular process. It's, again, very important to understand that addicts do not relapse because of triggers. Yes, the triggers do play a very important part in the whole process, but addicts relapse because they have a reservation, and we have spent quite a bit of time talking about what a reservation is. So the triggers have to go via the reservation, or if I can put it this way, the triggers or the cues trigger or activate the reservation inside the addict, and that is what sets the whole process of relapse in motion. The various areas of the triggers, the difference between the trigger and the cue. Trigger is the situation that causes the trigger or the need to use, and the cue is the actual opportunity. This is when I'm going to pick up. The triggers are biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. And we've looked earlier at the fact that addiction is a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual condition. Those are the areas of impairment, and those are the areas of risk. What do I mean by triggers are biological, or the reservation could be in the biological area? Well, that could be physical, for example. Somebody may have a physical condition that causes them pain, and that pain that is caused by the condition could serve as a trigger for the addict, and that trigger then activates the reservation, the reason in the back of the addict's mind at an unconscious level where they may give themselves permission to use. The trigger can be psychological. The addict is having a bad day. And when I say addict, I'm in this particular case talking about the addict in early recovery, not during addiction. The addict is having a bad day, there's maybe some anxiety or some depression, and that could also serve as a trigger that activates the reservation that in this particular case I can give myself permission to use. It could be social, the addict's inability to relate, the addict's inability to connect with themselves, with others, and there's very often that feeling of isolation, of loneliness, and that could also be a trigger that activates the reservation. And spiritual, just values and morals and some contact with something or someone greater than myself. That could also very often create a sense of disconnect and also a sense of isolation, and again, that could also be a trigger. The two pillars that support the reservation are denial and character defects, and these are pillars that support reservation in that these are also areas that can be activated, that can be triggered, that can contribute towards the process of relapse. Denial, it's important to understand that denial for the addict is not necessarily the same as denial for anybody else. For the most part, most people know when they are in denial, they know when they're being dishonest with themselves, they know when they're not facing up or owning up. For the addict, however, it is very often unconscious that the addict doesn't even realize that they are in denial, that they are not owning up, that they are not facing up. There are three main areas of denial that the addict goes through. First one is rationalization. This is where the addict gives themselves permission in the form of explaining to themselves why this is okay to pick up. I'm going through a very rough time. I'm feeling very stressed. I'm feeling overwhelmed. The next step is justification, where the addict make it okay for them to use. It's, I need some escape. I need some relief. There's something that I need to do. And the minimization is the downplaying or making the situation less serious than it is. And that very often is saying, well, I'm not going to have cocaine, I'm only going to have weed. So it's the downplaying the seriousness of it. And also that I referred to earlier on the famous last words of the addict relapses. Just this one time. So it's minimizing and downplaying. Once the denial process is underway, and what I mean by that is, once that process is underway in the sense of the addict is not consciously aware of it, doesn't find a way to interrupt this process, what gets triggered next are the character defects, the survival and defense mechanisms. And that includes things like dishonesty, covering up, trying to fool others. And that would very often be related to trying to destroy evidence, trying to stop anybody else from finding out, planning on how to get away with it. That is basically what the character defects are that support the denial. So the addict is now at the place they've rationalized, they've justified, they've minimized. The character defects start to be activated, and they start to plan how they can get away with it. They start to plan on the lies they're going to tell, and very often it's quite comprehensive planning that take place at the time. And once those two processes are underway, it's very much that the brain has gone into survival mode, and we spoke quite in depth before what happens when the brain goes into survival mode. The need to use becomes overwhelming. The emotional brain and the survival brain are activated, and they basically gang up against the thinking brain, if I can put it that way. In the thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, because by that time the whole process in the brain is John has to use in order to survive the pain or the cravings or the potential withdrawal system, withdrawal process, the withdrawal experience. So the addict behavior kicks in. What is the addict behavior? To use. The addict behavior, whatever the means are for me to get away from this pain. The only value being to survive, the only moral, whatever it takes. So what happens with the addict behavior, the addict acts out. It's just a diplomatic way of saying the addict picks up. So this person that goes and finds the drug of choice, and they act out. And a couple of hours later or the next day, what happens? The consequences kick in. Oh my goodness, what have I done? How could I have done this? And then the consequences become very real to them. The reaction from the loved ones of whatever the other consequences that they knew about before the time, but during this whole relapse process with a survival mentality, if I can put it the way that kicks in, the consequences become of lesser importance, and the addict doesn't really care at the time until the mind starts to clear up and they're starting to realize that what they've done. And what happens is the guilt and the shame that go with the consequences can contribute towards an ongoing relapse process, because that again could serve as a trigger to use in order to escape. So that cycle is activated, and that is one of the many reasons why most addicts go on using binges when they relapse, being the guilt and the shame that they experience that triggers the addict again, so they keep the cycle going until there is some kind of intervention or they ask for help.